Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Time with Steve and friends. We've got our old buddy back, Daniel Sanderson. He's going to be talking about his new book. He also thinks Adam Smith liked Plato. Should be fun, be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. We are back and we are live for another episode of Steve Keen and Friends. Hope you've shared us on your favorite platform. We're on YouTube, X, and LinkedIn. So please do get your economically minded mates over here to join in. Subscribe to keep us in your feed and hit that bell on YouTube so you can get a notification when we're going live. This week, we've got Daniel Sanderson back in the house to explore a unique idea. Was Adam Smith the father of modern economics, influenced by Plato? And if so, what could that mean for how we understand Smith's work today, more broadly, the way we think about markets, justice, and society? So basically, was the oft misquoted invisible hand intended to mean something more than blind market forces? Was it really intended to include an element of economic justice? Daniel is the co-author of his new book, Plato Reimagined, and he has been reconsidering Wealth of Nations in particular to see if Smith's work may not just be about self-interest in markets, but rooted in deeper Platonic ideals of ethics and the common good. Now, the implications of this are enormous because a Platonist reading might suggest that markets can't just run on efficiency, but on a deeper quest for justice and fairness, which is a pretty radical idea given today's obsession with the economy as some sort of automaton with no ethical center. So let's do this. Let's get Daniel in here and let's get this thing started, shall we? Here he is. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Now, mate, while you've been away, you've been messing about. You've been writing a book as well. So maybe we should just have a quick peek at that. And if we can at least see the cover, and maybe just give us a quick rundown of what's been going on with that before we dive in.
Well, let's maybe introduce the academic in the room. So Dr. Martine Dieperbroek, I met her on a project on Planck's, and effectively this was making an animated model of her and having her give some course instructions. Now this was done with Adobe Character Animator, and what's really happening in the industry is that AI is changing so fast. The process of actually making, we even experimented it with on this show too, with Ty's avatar, and now it's just so it's so much more improved and interesting and useful.
I wasn't expecting to be talking about AI straight away, though. Fine,
Yeah.
but this is okay. Interesting turn. So,
Yeah.
so, but tell me about the book itself and the content from your point of view. What's the big? We're going to obviously dive into it in great detail, but I guess I just wanted to. It doesn't, the book isn't talking about the issue we're going to talk to about tonight. So I just wanted to just maybe set the stage on that, and maybe just get a little bit about the book for those who are maybe interested in it.
Yeah, so you can see I'm a Platonist. I'm really wide and abstract, and it's like pull me in. Okay, so the point was that I had this prior arrangement and working relationship with Professor Diepenbrook, and we worked on a series, and then we collaborated on this book together. And so we went through each one of the dialogues and pulled what we thought was the most relevant points, relevant cited Stephanus numbers, and then basically provided some insight and commentary into that. There's also dialogues that have been put into the book, and these are dialogues between Sophia, a newly created embodiment of wisdom, and then we also have Plato, Socrates, and Isocrates. Isocrates was a rhetorician. So yeah, we have these kind of like supporting dialogues that are in every chapter that go along with the commentary.
Great. All right. So now we're taking all that knowledge of Plato and I guess that entire ethical framework, and we're going to plug it into economics tonight, right? So I think
Yes.
probably we're gonna need some help, aren't we? So let's get Mike and Steve out here as well, so that we can dive into this and see how they've been going. Here's Mike, and here's Steve.
Hey guys.
Howdy.
Hey,
Good
gents.
to have Daniel back.
Yeah, he's
Yeah,
looking
been a
all
while.
lumberjack today, so that's cool.
Lumberjack Dan, yeah.
Lumberjack
good.
and lumberjacked.
Flattery, mate. This is what you need to come back. If you go away for long
Flattery,
enough.
sarcasm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. So how do we kick this off, chaps? There's an idea I had, I guess, about. I was thinking it's quite a radical idea because I think it would challenge the conventional view of markets. Is that a good place to start, do you think, Daniel? Where would you like to go with this if you had the floor to just decide how should we talk about this issue?
Yeah, let me summarize it very simply. I mean, I think that the substrate that is Plato's philosophy is, like Whitehead says, it's the footnotes of all of the arts, and that wisdom is impregnated in the fabric of reality. Now, that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, because there's a lot of materialists, there's a lot of scientists out there, and I approached Plato's dialogues actually with that emphasis. And I think that you have to put it into context that what Plato was doing is really trying to capture the way he saw reality, right? Now, there's a fundamental leap there. I'm not going to get into the leap. Please remind me to talk about that a little bit later. But what I'm saying is that if there's he's describing societies as a whole, and how, and remember the axiom, the starting point from all of Plato's, I'll call it doctrine, really, okay? Because it's really, if you want to live the ideal life, right? And that's quite a claim. That's quite a claim. And so we fast forward and we bring this into Wealth of Nations. And what is that pursuit if not trying to find the truth? I mean, before we jumped off and went to introducing the show, Mike was talking to Steve about doing something. I mean, Steve said, thank you for the props on Minsky. And, Mike's like, hey, no, it's the truth. And that's the thing. That's the ideal of the academic. They're like, we forge this truth function. I try and operate my entire universe around that truthful representation of the way things ought to be.
And
that's a Platonist. That's the essence of what it means to be a Platonist.
And I think I'm going to pull in Mike on this. What's your thoughts, at least on where this is going, Mike? What should we be looking at if the implication is, and it's a big implication, right? Because I don't think anyone else has made this connection before that I was aware of. But so if Smith turned out to be a Platonist, to you, what are the implications?
Well, there's a couple of things that Dan was discussing here that were triggering things in my mind. If we want to first talk about old Adam Smith, everybody kind of knows The Wealth of Nations. They might not know the entire title of the book, but they kind of know that, sort of. And they all know The Invisible Hand. They might know about the Pin Factory. Most of the book is about the English Corn Laws. It's this thick, and the famous stuff is this teeny little. But it's seen as the sort of start of modern economics, or maybe it was Keynes and the physiocrats who preceded Smith by a little bit, but he's at the starting line of modern economics in all the textbooks and what have you. And he's seen as the original sort of Milton Friedman, the advocate for free markets and what have you. But what I was always taught, and when I studied the history of economic thought some years ago, was that you really have to look at Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments first, the book that preceded The Wealth of Nations, and to see his views on, sort of empathy for others and societal connections. And Smith wasn't advocating, if you look at both books, a Wild West, free-for-all, Darwinian, every man for himself kind of thing, but rather, he emphasized the need to take the concerns of others into account, sort of put yourself in their shoes and when you act and what have you. So I don't know if that makes him a Platoist or what have you. I read Plato's Republic as an undergraduate, and that's probably the last time I touched Plato. I'm reminded of the movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where these high school kids go in the phone booth and go back in time to study for a history test, and whatever. And they brought, I guess, history. They brought back Mr. Socrates. Philosophy stuff. So it's like
I haven't watched that movie. I've got to watch that movie.
Yeah, I need to. They had Napoleon. They had all these. I need to maybe get a phone booth and go back and talk to Plato or something to really brush up on my my Plato. The other thing, real quick, that struck me at the original remarks here is academics are searching for truth and what have you. That's what I thought when I was a naive kid, and I thought, I don't want to go in the corporate world. I want to go into the academy because it's not about, profits. It's about searching for the truth, and the logic of the argument wins the day. I couldn't have been more wrong.
It doesn't.
Not how academics. Not at all.
Yeah, afraid not.
Our academics, well, not all, but a lot of them want to publish papers in journals. And they say, what do I have to do to do that? And they'll sell their soul to do that. And, they conform. There's a normal science. So what's normal science? Okay, I'll do that if I can get journal publications and promote it and what have you. So I'm not entirely sure we're searching for the truth inside of universities. Maybe that the truth seeking should be conducted elsewhere.
Yeah, I want to come back to that idea of truth too in a minute. Steve, just before we bring Steve in on this, Mike, what do you think is just what's your impression of how Smith may have been co-opted, his message or his ideas may have been co-opted into this and morphed into this kind of metastasized into this other version of markets and what they're supposed to do and economies are supposed to do?
Yeah, my understanding is that the most read economics book of the 20th century was Keynes's General Theory. It's a book that everybody has read, but not really read. They form an opinion of it based on,
have it on their bookshelf.
Right. And they get an excerpt out of it or what have you. And that's their mental model of what it's all about. And I suspect that's what, if you've ever seen The Wealth of Nations or ever read, The Wealth of Nations is quite easy to read, actually. Not everybody is. Thorsten Veblen, oh my God, lots of luck there. David Ricardo, more difficult to read. Keynes, off and on, clear and not clear. Adam Smith is very clear, very easy to read. Karl Marx is fairly easy to read, if we're talking about who's easy, who's not. But the book is yay thick. And if you want to like plow through that, an economic tome from the 18th century, I mean, how many people have the tenacity to do that? So most people don't. They hear about the invisible hand and they hear a political argument, and then that's all they, that's how it originates, I suspect.
Understood. So Steve, I'm gonna ask you about this as well, but first we're gonna get you to do chatters. So
Okay.
It's nice to have the start of the show on. He hasn't said a word yet, and we're going to get him to do chatters. That's how much we care about you guys in the chat.
There you go. I'm going to go back with Niliva Carr, John Carter, Jose, Geese, Garen Osborne, Roy Peace, Toasty Death. That could be coming our way for everybody. Rusty Lidrazar. Okay. Gibbo675, Dan, David Collins, Shote, Wayne P, Sam Silver, The Hasty Ent, Ken Crawford, David K, William Branch, William Turner, Nomad Livecast, Alpha, Gavin Van, Matt 34314333. Oh, yuck. Nicole Wolfico, Wolf CEO, The Herald of Change, Bob Liore, Emilio Sempra, Sherry Wine, Algo Rhythm, Thomas Darlington, and down from the top, Web Freaks, Ghost on the Half Shell, Scott the News, Economics in One Lesson, Tony Waka Udazi, Danger Zone, Dreg Eye, Jerry Lynn's, Reagan Boychuk Reagan, Rob Pierce, Michael D'Souza Cruz, hello again, Jen Zidikic, White and Sunny Out, TR and Jen Zidikic. Again, we've got two Jens.
Hey, and welcome to everybody in the chat. Good to have you all here. I will be looking out for questions to ask the panel, of course, as always. So as much as we can, we're going to get you guys involved. But Steve, what were you thinking of there when we were talking about that problem?
Well,
go on.
I've got to go back to my original reading of Smith was, I think I first read in my undergrad days, but I read him intensely when I did my history of economic thought evaluation of where Marx's labor theory of value came from and why it was wrong. And but what I did was I read the Smith, Ricardo, and then all of Marx in chronological order. And Smith, I had some appreciation for him, but I didn't see him as the father of economics, as most people argued he was. There are things about Smith which I really quite enjoyed, though, and one of those was that he was quite anti-usury. And people tend to think that Smith is somebody who's going to be in favor of the free market everywhere. Well, if you read him on what he wrote about interest rates, he argued in favor of controls on the maximum rate of interest. And his logic was that if you have a maximum rate of interest, which is just above the market rate, the people who will not be able to get money will tend to be what he called profligates. And I've forgotten, but it was profligates and something else with P, and I've forgotten what the term, but promoters. It basically meant people who are Ponzi schemers. We'd call them Ponzi's today. So he said if you have a maximum rate of interest that can be charged by banks, then the only people who are going to be ruled out of that are people who are going to blow all the money anyway because they're irresponsible, or they're selling some sort of projector. That's what projectors and profligates. And the projectors were similar to what we mean by Ponzi schemers today. So he's in favor of a control on the rate of interest. Now, the person who was against any controls and said we should leave it all to the market was Jeremy Bentham. So a large amount of what people take as being actually Smith was in fact Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham made a defense and said, well, what is the point of putting controls against this so-called sin of usury? And it was all basically, in Bentham, you could read all the free market libertarian stuff that we see today. So a lot of libertarians think they're basing themselves on the father of libertarian thought, whom they think is Smith. But in fact, there's anybody they're basing themselves on, it's Jeremy Bentham, not Smith.
So Daniel, let's come back to you, mate. For you, what are some of the obvious places in Wealth of Nations that you picked up, for example, where he seems to be a Platonist? I'm just hoping if there is any obvious places that you went, or is it an impression? What was for you, the evidence?
Well, there's the book that we brought up, which is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I believe this is also in Wealth of Nations as well. But the idea is the impartial spectator, and I thought that was really interesting. You know, when we kind of, as Steve mentioned, he went back to Adam Smith a lot when he was developing or realizing, recalling, even if you follow Plato's recollection theory. But when Steve was doing his work with Karl Marx, he's then going in. So he's kind of, you could assume you're kind of hunting for something, right? Like you've got something in your mind about that particular challenge to Marx's labor theory of value, and I believe you brought in elements of technology. Anyways, then you're looking through that particular lens. Now, when I looked at it, and of course, I had Plato on the brain, and I'm looking at this thing, and I'm going, well, what is this impartial spectator, right? Now, if everybody in the room defines God as something that's, something up in the sky that we pray to, and and really dismissive of it, then you cannot make this connection. But if you look at God from more of a biological projection, you can say that this is everything that we believe to be good is embodied in this figure, right? And so basically, it's trying to contain. And is it dogmatic? I mean, when I first heard this, I thought, man, this is not something I want to get behind. But I think that the pursuit of understanding and where we came from and how we formed these monotheistic goals and these ideals is worth leaning into, because the conversation that's going on in a conciliant sort of form, right? You take the apologetic of somebody like Jordan Peterson. And what's he saying? He's saying that these two things deserve to be integrated, right? And so I think that somebody interested in the book or interested in the course would be like, "Hey, that's fascinating. I'd like to explore that."
And so has it not been really recognized before that might be the case, given that it was written in a time when Judeo-Christian, culture was the norm? I mean, he didn't write a book that was totally secular, or was it perceived as totally secular then? I don't know. I would have thought everyone thought he was a Christian, a good Christian, and writing about good Christian values to a point. Does that make any sense?
No, but I tell you, just because the timelines don't make sense, because Christianity didn't emerge for another 600 years, right?
I know, I'm not talking about Plato. Sorry, I'm talking about. I was talking about.
I see.
Yeah. Otherwise, no, that would make no sense. I'm sorry. No, I mean,
sometimes I have to catch up with you guys. It's not. Sorry.
I sincerely doubt that. No, it was just a miscommunication. But yeah, so if Adam Smith was conceived in that way, he surely wasn't writing a purely secular book in those days, was he?
I think it's largely secular. I just try and recall any religious references or anything of that nature in the Smith or Ricardo. And,
but just the culture they were in and they were writing to, they would have known there would have been interpretations of what they're writing, so they didn't have to be explicit about the moral implications. Do you think? What do you think of that?
No, Dan? What I would say, it is a very secular book, right? I mean, you're not saying that your conscience comes from this relationship to God, right? You're not saying that.
Okay.
But to acknowledge individual autonomy and the abilities that gives individuals is something that is worth remembering, right? And the fact that he's focusing on the internal nature of the human being, I think, is really important, and still presents itself as an enormous gap in economics, right? I mean, so Steve, you're an institutional, post-Keynesian, right? Okay. Now, you don't have deterministic understanding of everything down to the agent model level, right? There's a gap between what's happening in agent models and then what the macro reveals that that you implement into institutional economics. Is that not correct?
Well, I tend to work entirely at the macro level. Dan, as it happens, I don't use agent modeling because I'm actually critical of thinking in terms of the individual and then extrapolating it to social level, and that's what a large amount of economics have been of that nature. And in fact, I'd say Smith is probably pretty responsible for that. A lot of the reasoning, Smith is aware of social classes, and that's one up on the neoclassicals try to ignore them completely. But there is a way in which the neoclassicals look back to Smith in some ways and say, well, Smith is talking about the motivation for the individual entrepreneur, and that motivation at the individual level then gets projected to what you see being the actual nature of the society. And I think that's basically, economics have been led astray by trying to think in those ways, working from the individual element of a system up to the system itself. And when you look at the way the system in fact behaves, the structure of the system gives you far more of its behavior than the individuals within it. They tend to be channeled by the structure of the system, which is why Mark and I are into system dynamics. So we downplay the importance of thinking about the individual, the structure of society, and the fact we have, you predominantly earn your income through a wage, a minority earn it through owning capital, others in the financial sector. The various part of the system they're in has a large impact on determining their behavior. So you don't get that capacity to go from the individual to the collective. Emergent properties get in the way as well in terms of how we talk about complex systems. So I think a lot of it gets lost in the individual thinking that was a large part of what Smith spoke about. He had social classes. I'm not saying he didn't, but he had the kernel of getting away from social classes, which is what the neoclassical have done, and those are the parts of Smith they like to quote.
Yeah, well, let me give the audience the idea of kind of how this economics connection came up. So I have a descendant that was received her PhD in philosophy from Cornell in 1896.
You mean an ancestor?
Yeah. What did I say?
You said descendant.
Oh, yes, that's right.
You were getting caught in a few. I was about to wonder about time. I've just been reading Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy again, and in fact, the section where they go to the restaurant at the end of the universe, and they're trying to say, how do you talk about the future in the past while you're in the present, and all the tenses that get involved there. So you've tripped out. In fact, we better say this is actually the anniversary, the 45th, not the 42nd anniversary of the publication of the first volume of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So maybe that's what the universe got in your way. But your ancestor.
Yeah, she wrote and her thesis was, let me read this here, on the ethical systems of Adam Smith. And I still don't have a copy of it, but where I'd like to take it is say, okay, fine, let's focus the conversation a little bit and say the ethics of Adam Smith. What ethics can you derive from the works of Adam Smith?
That's a good question. What would you derive? What would be your derivation on that front?
Well, I don't think that this impartial spectator is something that should be eliminated and cast out from the canon of your work. I mean, I know that the contribution is bigger than Steve. You have to admit that, right? I mean, you're part of this growing unfolding of human knowledge, right? And I've actually been and witnessed and said, I think you've made real contributions to that.
Okay.
Right? So we want like he has, like, absolutely. And what I'm saying is that when I look at the individual motivation, okay, because this is that we're driven by our own self-interest, okay, and we're also driven by and there's an inner voice which he calls as the internal spectator, okay. Now just leave that in the table. Don't expel it from the. Otherwise, you run the risk of your economic system also becoming dogma.
Yeah.
400 years from now, you know what I'm saying? Like, if it becomes adopted, you need to be able to keep some of those ancient, important sort of things, that individual, the autonomy, self-interest. These are the things these are the watchwords to, and an economic system that has that feedback loop to the people, the pulse of the feelings of the species. And that's us. That's the substrate from which we emerge from, according to the work of Antonio Damasio, right?
Can I bring an
scientific and cellular level?
I just want to bring an idea in here because we were talking about truth before, and I wanted to get back to it. It's an important point because it does relate, Daniel, to what you're just talking about. Been reading, I'm not completed it yet, but I've been reading Yuval Noah Harari's Nexus. And one of the critical points in it is about information, and that we have been talking about information in a way that it leads to the truth, and it does, but the truth is often so unbelievably complex that it's very hard to pass on in any meaningful way to lots of people, because you always have to leave something out. And so you end up with a lot of whataboutism when someone says, look, here's the truth. Oh, you haven't thought about this? Well, I can't picture everything, can't explain everything all in one space. And so what he says is what's happened is human evolution has left us with a version of information that's actually one in which ideas that connect people is actually what drives human development, rather than the truth. Although the truth, it'd be nice if it was both, but the problem is often it's just outright lies and nonsense. But the crux of it is that truth is one thing, and ideas that connect people and build systems are another. Sometimes they overlap, but often they don't because of manipulation and because of power struggles. So I wondered if that's what's been going on. I want to bring that back in with truth, just because I suspect it feels naive if we hope there's just this one truth that if only people would get hold of it, everything would be okay. But that's not actually how the world works, unfortunately, at least social systems. And Mike, can I bring you in on that idea? Because you brought up the idea of truth and what truth is, and you discovered at university it just doesn't work like that because people have to go and earn a living.
Yeah, and then the question arises, are we all living in a simulation? People are starting to talk about that, the blue pill and the red pill and the matrix, and is it just our perceptions and what have you? We all have different mental models and different perceptions of reality. It starts getting way outside of my sandbox.
That's why I asked you.
Right.
I wanted to find if there's something you didn't know.
And, the philosophy of science, epistemology and all that stuff. How do you know? Knowing about knowing and what have you starts to make my head hurt. But I mean, these are the great questions of the ages. I mean, the Adam Smith's impartial observer, whatever, I can't remember. Was that Dan? What he called them? I'm trying to remember it's kind of like John Rawls is, you step behind the veil of ignorance, and you don't know your social status or any of that stuff when you identify principles for the structuring of society. And you got to keep in mind the most vulnerable in society and all that. Economists finally got around to having a code of ethics not that many years ago. The classic, Steve knows this, cartoon of the Soviet premier and his underlings standing on top the Kremlin watching the parade of missiles go by in tanks, and then the dudes marching with suits, and they're like, well, who's that? And he says, that's our most secret weapon, the most destructive of them all. Those are our economists, right? So they finally got around to saying, we really need something
weapons
like
of mass destruction.
Actually, the only mistake on that joke was it should have occurred in New York rather than Moscow, because the economists did the damage, particularly to Russia, of course, at Chicago. It should be a parade in Chicago, and that would be the right place to locate that joke.
Yeah, Hyde Park. Yeah. So anyway, economists have realized, that we need a code of ethics to guide what we do, or at least we should follow some sort of moral code. And various authors over the year, thinkers have, tried to say, okay, well, how would you assemble something like that? Like I said, most recently, in terms of what I'm familiar with, was John Rawls. I'm going back to my graduate student days. In terms of something, though, Steve said a while ago that I thought was quite good. He was talking about, rather than sort of society being the sum of the individual behaviors of individuals, that it's really the design of the social system, the socioeconomic, environmental, technical system that guides or shapes how individuals behave. That's kind of a systems point of view. And I can tell you, one of the very first things we do in system dynamics is we have people play something called the beer game. And you may or may not have heard this thing. If you Google it, it's very well known. Peter Senge wrote a book in the early 90s that describes it. It's called The Fifth Discipline, if anybody's interested. But in the beer game, it's a game. It's fun. You're running a supply chain. And there's a retailer, a wholesaler, a distributor, and a factory, or a brewery, if you will. And you have little pennies or bingo chips. Those are your cases of beer. You start with 12 at each position in the game. So 4 people are running this supply chain. And all you have to do every simulated week of the game is order beer. How much beer do you want? Because you want to keep your customers happy. So the brewery sells to the distributor to the wholesaler to the retailer, and the retailer, there's a deck of cards determining the retailer's customers, what they're ordering from it. And then the orders, so beer comes down from the brewery through the distributor, through the wholesaler, through to the retailer, to the customer, and then orders for beer go upstream. So it's quite a easy to understand game and supply chain. And what happens in the game is it starts in equilibrium. So there's orders for 4 coming in from the deck of cards to the retailer, and the game is set up in equilibrium. So there's 4 orders going upstream and 4 cases of beer going downstream. And then there's a one-time shock to the system. It goes from 4 to 8 cases of beer, and it remains at 8 for the rest of the game on the order of 48 weeks, 48 iterations of the game. And here's the thing. Everybody who plays the game does the exact same thing. They overreact. So they way over order beer. And then they say, oh my God, I suddenly have too much, because they keep ordering, even though it's not here yet, because there's this delay. And then they have too much, so they way under order. So you have people, it's 8, and they're ordering 200. Just ridiculous number. So you get this big oscillation. And as you move upstream towards the end of the supply chain, the oscillations get bigger. And so when the people are finished playing, they record their orders. You ask them to graph what happened at their station, and then they go on a break, and you assemble all of their data, and it's their graph. And when people come back, they see all of their plays of the game. All the other people have played the game. They see their plays of the game. And then you hang on the wall. People have played it many times in the past, and everybody plays the game the same way. Not identically, but has the same basic pattern. And you ask people, well, why is that? How come people, young people, old people, highly educated people, less educated people, people here today, they all play the game virtually identically? Why is that? And the answer is the system is designed to oscillate like that. The airplane is designed to fly that way. So guess what? It flies that way. Yeah. It's not a perfect match every time, because individuals have some people overreact more, some overreact less, and what have you, but the same basic pattern exists because that's how the system is designed. So you ask them, well, if you don't like this instability thing, what should you do? And you get them to redesign the system, redesign our institutions in society, for example, to get them to behave differently, that it's the structure that causes the behavior. So Steve is right on when he said that. And I can tell you, I facilitated that game a gazillion times, and it's always the same. And people are like, they can't believe it. One last thing with this beer game, the retailer is seeing the deck of cards, the orders coming in from the deck of cards, and shipping those pennies, those cases of beer off the game board. But all the other players don't see it. So you ask them, everybody but the retailer, hey, what do you think the pattern of orders was on that deck of cards? And almost everybody draws the same shape they experienced at their position, overshoot and undershoot. And then you show them it was 4, 4, 4, and then 8 the rest of the time. And so they were blaming the deck of cards for their problems at their position, they weren't blaming their own decisions and they weren't blaming the structure of the system. They're blaming external factors. Interest rate changed, the exchange rate changed, a shipping container got wedged in the Suez Canal and blocked the supply chain. External factors they're blaming rather than looking within to the design of the system.
Back to the truth issue, Daniel, can you elaborate a bit on that in Plato and truth and Smith and truth? I think we might have a debate here.
Oh, well, it was because I was really enjoying what Mike was saying. That's bang on. I really like that, and I could continue that. But okay, so back to the truth, and the idea that comes to my mind is a dog and its sniffer. So it's the mental maps that this dog is actually making in the world when it actually smells. It's orientated in a how would I be able to show it? It's like here to here, and it's tracking, right? It's tracking the truth. Now, we happen to be the one species that we know of with such an amazing prefrontal cortex to be able to even imagine, right? This is our superpower. We're standing at the top of a tree branch, and like a bird would jump off and fly. We're forgetting the fact that we have this an enormous capability to imagine, right? Okay, so when we talk about truth, what I'm trying to say is that, okay, and I need to frame this correctly, Steve, because I think we're saying the same things, and the reason why I'm outside of your comfort level just a little bit is because I think you can get there. I think we're saying the same things. Okay, so what I spend time with in Plato is I took a concept like justice and I thought, is there something what comes to mind as the foundational sort of origin of justice? Like, where does it emerge from psychologically? What like Piaget's sort of throw the baby up thing, and it's like its reaction is to do the scare thing, right? Like it goes, it's just like Mike said, it happens. It's part of human behavior. Okay. So I was trying to think of something like that for justice, right? Is this this big anomaly? It's this big sort of question thing that goes throughout the dialogues. And so I said, okay, let's use this working definition of discernment as the substrate, the primordial sort of beginning of justice, okay? And if you think about it for a second, it's really needed, right? I mean, the work you do, okay, as you study and move towards the discipline that you've participated in shaping, you must have the discernment that this is an improvement over something else, right? I mean, that's how your work unfolds.
But there's a difference in the philosophy the philosophical foundation I have, because I haven't read a lot of philosophy. That's one of my weak points. But most of the time I did, what I saw was something trying to say what is truth and things of that nature. What is truth? What is meaning? What is being? Etc. etc. And I was always uncomfortable with that as a question. Yes, obviously I'm driven in my own motivation by trying to get a true picture of reality. But I get there in a way which is actually more compatible with the philosophical way, which is more compatible with the system dynamic stuff that Mike and I are both so strongly into. And that's when I read Marx for the first time. I hadn't read Hegel beforehand, and I expected to see the usual description of the dialectic that I'd been given in, Marxist pamphlets I'd been given, or talking with Marxists as a university, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which I thought was just a tongue twister. I didn't think it was actually a logical statement at all. What I found instead, that it wasn't Marx or Hegel's dialectic at all. Marx's and Hegel's was the idea of what they call foreground, background, and tension. And it starts from saying any unity exists in society. There's no Robinson Crusoe. So a society will focus upon one aspect of that unity, which becomes its foreground, but the unity itself has to have its entirety to exist. So there's a foreground that creates a background. Things you focus upon create things you neglect, and that gives you a tension between the two. And what that ends up being is a philosophy of change. That's not a philosophy of saying this is truth or this is rights or this is deep principles of saying this is how things change. And that fundamentally is what system dynamics is all about. We build models saying this is how something changes. And then out of that, we get a picture of the dynamics of the system. So when it comes to how I do my searching for the truth, a large part of it is saying, how can I get statements of the process of change that are realistic? And therefore I can not like a static concept of truth, but how does the social system or concepts, the intellectual concepts, how do they develop over time? And I find that I just find that the truth foundation, by its nature, I think ends up being a static conception, and that's a handicap.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'll still maintain that we're saying the same. I have much more of a conciliant position towards the people that default to metaphysics and religion. You know, right? Like I'm not afraid to confront those communities and a way to bring those two communities together. And so when I show up and I'm talking to my secular friends, right, here tonight, I'm saying I'm also a secular person, individual, right? And I think that ultimately the biggest question, the most abstract thing that we can look at here and try and agree upon within the spirit of wisdom is that the work that you do, okay, if you, it has a incremental benefit to humankind exploring the more accurate representations of what economics is, right? So for instance, if you started to see your work, okay, and post-Keynesian economics and system dynamics be implemented into society at a rapid pace, and then all of a sudden you realize that, holy fuck, we're sliding towards a chaotic societal breakdown, right? Okay. I mean, I'm not, that would be cause for alarm.
It is cause for alarm, unfortunately.
But chances are that's not what's happening. You wouldn't be pursuing something if you knew that's what was at the other end of the road, right? You're pursuing the discipline because it's a benefit. There's a benefit of your work over the neoclassical rubbish, right?
Yeah.
For who?
That is what motivates.
Who's the benefit for? Yeah, who's the benefit? Who benefits from that?
Society.
There we go. Bingo.
I can't argue with that.
Right? That's the ideal. You cannot escape that. If it was something else, anything else other than that, your discernment detector would go off and you're like, fuck, wait a minute, no. Right? Now, there's a lot of people that play a blind eye to that. That's what Socrates used to call the daemon.
Yeah.
Which the Christians turned into a demon.
Okay.
Right? But, so you see how I've kind of moved you up the ladder right to a point where we're all in agreement on an abstract concept of basically why you do what you do. This is your contribution to society as a whole. I mean, you're a great husband, apparently. You're a good friend. I know that. Well,
you certainly won't find it about the first one.
What was there? There's a vote of 2, so you're about 50-50. Right?
So do you see, is Platonism something you think is specific to people with a specific orientation, like the thing I have, which I've got to agree with you, but, would you say that neoclassicals have a Platonic disposition?
No, I think.
That's right. Okay.
Well, here's the thing. No, but here's the thing. It's like, so now the religious wisdom can help you. You say there's people that are on like a noble path. Okay. There are people that are trying, to do the right thing in the world. And right, like Mike said, he goes, so many people are not. Yeah. Okay. So that means we don't stop talking about what was good. Even if you're the only one in the room, you're like, hello, emperor, you're not wearing clothes, right? Like, why does that story stick out? Why does it stick out?
So in that sense, the neoclassicals are not Platonist.
Well, they're not Platonists for the reason that, okay, so I was watching a Jordan Peterson lecture series, his Academy, by the way. I'm reluctantly a Jordan Peterson fan, right? Like I go down kicking and screaming. I'm like, you know, and then the academics are like, Jordan Peterson, you know, he's not a real academic, right? But damn, is his lecture on Nietzsche incredible. It's incredible. He's got this new university, and one of his lecture series is called Nietzsche Philosophizing with a Hammer. And it's great. It's like fantastic. Now, the reason why I bring that up, and I did this to Dave earlier on when he introduced me, I start out really wide and then I come back in and I look at it and I go, what he was actually talking about, Jordan Peterson was talking about, is careerism inside of academia. He said it's littered with that, right? You make your publications so that you can be invited to the cocktail party to over dramatize it. And there's other reasons and stuff like that, but you were like basically just feeding the cesspool of something that has lost its ideal path, its ideal truth, Steve. Right?
But they would see themselves.
We established that.
But they would see themselves as going down the ideal path.
No, that's right. That's right. And what the Greeks are trying to teach us is that what is the method for doing that? Okay. And then there's the virtues. There's the core virtues. Okay. So courage, justice, wisdom. Right. Okay. You want to focus on those, and temperance. Okay. Temperance, like, come on, right? Like there's a bunch of economists in the room here, right? So, what?
Pretty boring, most of them, frankly. They don't know how to throw a decent party that saved their lives. But that's
well, we were talking about that earlier, right? Like, what would a party of economists look like? And
it might be a live stream
I must throw this in here.
Yeah,
I saw somebody putting up on Twitter the collective nouns of various animals and then also professions. And I absolutely love what the person suggested for economists. Have a guess what it was?
I don't know.
A smug of economists.
Yeah. Perfect.
Probably, yeah.
Mike, isn't it, Mike? You're an experience. All these bloody neoclassicals. We've got it. They're 100%. So effing smug. Yeah.
So you're in a party. So Mike and Steve, you're in a party with economists, and they're all smug, kind of walking around. Who walks in the room, and you're like, oh, exciting person. Like, wouldn't Ann Pettifor? You'd be excited if you saw her. You'd be like, oh, Ann, how you doing?
Well, I went to some pretty unusual parties as a student, as an economist. I better add there. Mike, what about? I'll hand over to Mike for a while because I'll come back on my economic party front, but. We used to throw a lot of very interesting parties at Sydney University.
Yeah.
And I'll Mike, interrupt me when you feel like it, but we used to throw 6 times a year. We threw what we called a smoko. And the smoko goes back, it was apparently a Cambridge tradition, where you're supposed to serve sherry and you have cigars. And of course, we had casks of beer, crates of wine, and an ounce of dope at each of the parties. On a Tuesday night, twice a term, 6 times a year, and after the party, we would. I know you're not, Larry. You're beyond smug. After the party, we then go to a place called Casa Juanita in the heart of Sydney, and depending on how many survivors there were, a bit like about Tolkien's party we were looking at earlier. The survivors would go up to Casa Juanita to water their meals, and 30 people would roll in on a Tuesday night. And we'd all order garlic prawns and Barcelona chicken. And somehow this woman, Juanita, was able to cope with this every bloody time. Tuesday night, so she knew 6 times a year, a bunch of drunk students and stoned students and drunken stoned staff would roll in and order the same damn meal from her restaurant. We threw some good parties.
When education was done properly, basically.
Absolutely. Mike, your party time.
To this day, my wife will remind me when she'll say, can we go to, can I attend with her at one of her parties with the other nurses and stuff?
Yeah.
I'll be like, oh, and she'll bring up, I attended all of those parties with your graduate econ people. She goes, I never knew what the hell they were talking about. But they were so boring. And I was like, point well made.
Yeah.
They get dragged off to the nurses instead.
Yes. And they would, I don't know. There was always beer and stuff, of course, but they would be debating Rawls versus Nozick and neo-Marxism versus orthodox Marxism. And some of the students wanted to, they'd say, hey, we're going to go chain ourselves to Congressman Bradimus's door tomorrow to protest whatever. Want to come? And I was like, no, I got to study. Those types, the radical, they wanted to really put it, El Revolution or Viva la Revolution. Some might find that interesting. My wife was like, the elbow, can we leave now kind of stuff. So, not terribly, unless you're into it.
We had some interesting parties with interesting people. Parties for economists. I think something of interest rolling into that. I'm sorry, I can't even imagine how that party would go. I've been to a few straight neoclassical economist parties, and they were about as boring as your wife is complaining about some of your parties, Mike. And I think yours are better than the ones that I attended. So
I'm pretty sure we've lost half the audience already talking about economists at parties. Let's try.
No good.
I had to put this one on because
looky.
Welcome on.
Who's in the house? Here he is. Only an hour late, hey mate.
Look at this. It's the old gang. It's back together. The Beatles have come back together.
You guys should be on the top of a hotel somewhere.
Yeah.
So Doug Dowell's talking about the movie The Revenge of the Nerds. That was a great movie. I love that movie. It was so good. Yeah. And what was the other one that caught my attention here? Apollo 13 was the Revenge. That was also a great movie because I remember as a kid watching it live. And then I met Jim Lovell.
Did you? Wow.
Yeah, because he was from the Milwaukee area. I went to school in Milwaukee. I grew up north of Milwaukee, and he was an Eagle Scout, and I was an Eagle Scout. So when he was done being an astronaut, he was on the speaking tour, and he talked to all the Eagle Scouts in the area. So we got to meet him, and told us all the Apollo 13 stories, So good comments there from Doug Dowell, I think.
That was a superb film.
Yeah.
So I'm reminded of when talking about truth and all that stuff. When I was a student, we had to take this course. I've told this before on this live stream, but I'll repeat the story for those who haven't heard. In the first semester of my second year, we had to take a mandatory course. I don't remember the title of it. I could probably resurrect the notebooks and figure it out, but it was basically philosophy of science and philosophy of science applied to economics. So on the first day of class, we were all sitting there. There were probably 15 of us, 20 of us, and we're chatting because class hadn't started yet. And the professor walks in and he's carrying this giant pile of books and papers and stuff. He was one of these guys who assigned readings from 7 books over the semester and brought the 7 books in and said, you're going to read this one and you're going to look at it. And so he goes to the front. There was a table and a little lectern at the front. And he just takes this giant pile of books and papers and just drops them. And they go bang, and they hit the table real loud. And everybody stops and looks up, and he grabs the lectern and he leans over and he says, first words out of his mouth, how do you know if an explanation for something is true? And everybody's like, what? We didn't even get the syllabus yet, and the guy's starting in on us. And then I was like, wait a minute, that's a pretty good question. How do you know if an explanation for something is true? And the whole class was about, how do, philosophers think scientists explain things, well, then how do economists explain things? It turns out, I didn't know this at the time, economists organize themselves into schools of thought. And the various schools of thought have different ways deemed legitimate for explaining things.
That's pretty convenient.
Yeah, well, right.
Each one has a different set of rules.
Not surprised. And they read the same journals, they go to the same conferences, they swap PhD students and so forth. So it's a inbreeding or whatever you want to say. But broadly, we learned that there's 2 kind of different philosophies in economics. One follows Rene Descartes and the other follows David Hume. So the Descartians start with deductive logic, top down. Start with theory, and it has to be general. We're searching for the laws of the economic universe. So we can't be burdened by institutional details associated with a particular time or a particular place. So like Newton's laws and stuff are very simple and devoid of institutional detail. And from that, you derive testable hypotheses logically, usually mathematically. And then you finally look at the real world and see if your data, which is usually numbers, your measurements, support or not the theory, right? So that's sort of the traditional neoclassical economics theory leading to econometrically testable models. Whereas the heterodox economists, institutional economists or whatever, use a pattern modeling approach from David Hume. They start with the real world and they try to identify patterns. They find clues called themes and they connect them together. Well, this requires a systems approach. The parts of how they're connected together, and that forms an explanation. And if there's any regularities, they build up to principles. So it uses fundamental principles. It uses inductive logic. They sort of use a case study approach rather than math traditionally, because the mathematics could not represent the rich tapestry of the patterns that are identified in society. And so, later on, I figured out that's exactly the second thing. The David Hume thing is exactly what we do in system dynamics. We don't call it exactly the same thing, but that's exactly what we do. But then I was reminded of, circling back to Dan, Plato's cave. I do remember reading Republic and his cave. And of course, the Descartians will argue that you have to start with logic because your experiences in the real world can be deceiving, right? And that's like the shadows on the wall of Plato's cave, if I remember correctly. So I'm guessing Plato would be more in the camp of neoclassical economics and Rene Descartes, at least for that one piece of it. But I could be totally wrong because I've now told you everything I know about philosophy.
Mike, can I get you to respond to that question there from Economics in One Lesson? Well, it's not really a question, it's a statement, but I thought it was an interesting one based on what you're talking about there. The idea that financial news is always giving one sentence explanations for why the stock market's gone up or down, presented as the truth. And I used to take it seriously, but doesn't anymore. I mean, it's very reductive news, economic news, and economic, narratives, generally speaking, in the public eye anyway.
So in system dynamics, we were always taught from Jay Forrester that we build models, but that's not unusual because we don't have real economies, families, companies, state governments, cities, whatever inside of our heads. We have mental representations of these complex systems. We have models in our heads, and we use them to make our decisions. And so, we do modeling every day, whether we know it or not. And our models, our mental models change as we go about our lives, learning, experiencing, blah, blah, blah. So all system dynamics, at least the guy who founded it was take what you know inside of your head and make it formal, and let the machine do what humans are bad at, which is precisely thinking through the dynamic implications of one's own mental model. We're not good at mental simulation. Simulate this complex thing we're thinking about and then change one little thing and re-simulate it and compare it, and doing it accurately. Can't do that. But now, if that's true, or if that's a good way to think about, system dynamics, what Steve and I do with our modeling and tie and whatever, that does get us back to the philosophical question, it seems to me, is everybody can have different mental models of truth or of the economy or of, what have you. So is there truth, or is there just everybody has their own sort of view on what it is? There might be similarities, but there's often differences.
Daniel, can I take this in a slightly different direction? Just have a look at, so we can get practical and maybe look at some, more concrete examples of what you might be driving at. What might an economic system look like if it was run by a Platonist, or maybe another way we put it, if Adam Smith had been interpreted as a Platonist and it hadn't been got hold of in a way that's taken him off in a different direction. So let's be practical. I mean, where would the differences show up in tax and fiscal policy or in regulation? Is that something you've given any thought to, or is that bending you out of shape?
No, I mean, I think.
And Ty, I want to bring you in on this, so have a think about this as well.
The thing, Dave, is that the questions are so really awkward because they're not relevant, and the reason is that we live in our reality, and what Plato was trying to describe was reality.
That's fine, but
So-
what's wrong with going practical about it and looking at what it might be if we weren't living in the system that, of course, you're complaining about, and to a degree, we're saying, look, this could be better if we did it this way. So what's wrong with being practical?
Okay, so now look at how you're conceptualizing time there. You're saying, well, like if we switch this off and then we move over here in almost an instantaneous sort of transition, but that's not what happens.
Of course, no, it's got to be theoretical, but I'm just trying to find an angle to think about some of these things in practical terms to see if there was a way that this would turn into policy and real world things as well, rather than
right.
just in the abstract. But that's okay. We don't have to. That's what I said. That's why I was asking if it was an angle we could go for. But if not, we don't need to.
Yeah. It gets into all sorts of uncomfortable conversations. Like Steve said, he goes like, he's reading philosophy text, and when they start going into being and becoming and like, just give me something I can measure. Give me that. Let's go back to the corns on the cob, right? Give me something we can plug into a system. And you're as
resisting
Mike was
that, which is fair enough. I just wanted to know why.
No. Actually, I'm saying the one main thing you can take away with being a Platonist is that you ultimately want the best thing. And if the ideal continues to change, as Mike said, well, then is it completely is there any one direction that we seem to be orientated towards? And I would say, yes, it's the good. We're moving in a direction that's trying to make things better for humankind, right? On the whole. And so when you look at this and you say, what's that?
Keep going. Yeah, I'll come back.
Yeah. So I'm going to, if it turns out that there's more utility in having a systems approach, right? And having, and integrating statistics into the collective consciousness of how we understand and exist in reality, there's lots of evidence for it, right? I mean, our quantum models are all based off of statistical probability. And I want to show you this. I think I've shown this before. This is an astraguli. And this is they used to use these in ancient Greece to play ancient games of chance. So there's two, like one side is 40% of the surface area, then the other side is 40%, and then 10% and 10%. This reveals the Pareto ratio when you throw these, right? So the Greeks...
Dan, hey Dan, can you hold it up right to your camera just so everybody gets a look at what you're describing? Okay, beautiful.
Yeah. So it's a bone die. It's like a knuckle bone from a sheep. They used to play these. And so, like when I get people into a class, into a community, there's this astraguli calculator that I use to try and teach people. I took maybe Mike's suggestion and say, try and turn it into a game. That's what I'm doing in the class.
So I think one profitable way to think about why, let's say, the economics profession is the way it is, why the U.S. tax code is the way it is, and many things in society or even technologies where you say, there's a better way to do this, but we don't do it. Why is that? And it's the notion of path dependency. And it goes all the way back to Thorstein Veblen. Gunnar Myrdal won the Nobel Prize in economics for the application of his principle of circular and cumulative causation to developing economies. But basically, it's path dependency. And let me give you an example. And I can give Ty a nice homework problem here. For that matter, Steve, to see if they can pull this off in Minsky. So Polya was a Hungarian, I think he was a mathematician, and he was John von Neumann's teacher, if you give you some context here.
Okay.
And he postulated the following, where you can model it. We do it in system dynamics all the time to teach the kids. Apollo process. So here's what you do. You think of a vase, a clear vase, or a glass, or a parfait cup, or something like that, where it's clear, you can see it, and you put a black and a white marble or stone or whatever. It can be any two colors, doesn't matter, in there. So there's one of each. The market share is 50-50, if you will, of the black and the white marbles. And then you have a following rule. Give me a number from a random number generator, a uniform random distribution. So that means any number between 1 and 0 is equally likely. So give me a random variate from that distribution. If that random number is below the percentage of stones that are white, add a white stone. Otherwise, add a black stone or marble, right? So 50-50, the first random number, you got equal chance of it being below 50. So it's 50% or less. You get a white stone, or otherwise a black stone. And what you see is at the beginning, you'll get the market share kind of changing, and then it'll lock in. And the rest of the way, you'll get 70% black and 30% white, or almost every possible solution except 100% and 0, because you start with one of each. Or that's not possible to have one to be completely white or black, or is possible. It just depends on, you get sort of, it's random, and then you get locked into a particular path, and then you're locked in.
Yeah.
That means history matters. The idea that we're looking for laws of the universe that hold at any time and place is not true. That we're here today because of, among other things, historical considerations, and we're often locked in to an inferior solution. Nobody would design the U.S. tax code from scratch the way it is today. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Then why do we have it? Let's get rid of it and redo it. No, there's too many special interests and whatever who have a vested interest in keeping it the way it is, right? So we have it, right? And I think the economics profession is exactly that way. If you go to an economist who has 40 peer-reviewed articles in neoclassical outlets and 2 books, is a full professor, and has the esteem of the profession and of his or her students, and you show them Steve's way of doing things.
Yeah.
Even if they admit to you privately, quietly, I think you're right, are they going to stop doing what they're doing?
Oh, wow.
They're locked in. No way. They might quietly say, I think you're but then they'll go about their business, continue doing what they're doing. And I think that accounts for a whole lot of things in the world.
Which means they're not after the truth.
They're not Platonists, or they're false.
No,
they're not. But that's even consciously. They're not. They may the worst kind is the malevolent, like the intentionally malevolent.
You mean like Larry?
Hey,
Larry. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry.
Like, I was going to say, because you're going to be doing some stuff at Yale, and this is a division or part of, like the Nordhaus School, right, of business or economics.
Well, that's where Nordhaus was a professor. So yeah.
Oh, I see. So the reason why, like, I had asked Steve offline, I said, I want that, like, if you get a lecture on that, I think this is one of those things that's like a really interesting moment, right? Like I said, I'll, do a series of articles on it, because I think that it's just such poetic justice that you're an irony that you're there.
I think I'm more likely he's not even going to know I'm on campus. Okay.
Yeah. No, I realize that. That's the weird thing, right? So when you read a lot of the philosophers that I read, right, like Arthur Schopenhauer, I adore him. I think he's really great. And not so much Hegel, but I don't have the disdain of Hegel, right? Where in a lot of his works, like in Schopenhauer's works, he had not a single nice thing to say about Hegel. He called it complete rubbish and obfuscation and stuff like that, right? So it's really interesting to see how when an academic,
this is why I find the abstract idea of truth, even though, like, when you got me on the barrel there and said, okay, what you're trying to do is to improve truth, to get closer to truth about economics. That's quite true. Okay. The thing is, how do you determine something is true in philosophy? And there you have one philosopher trashing another one completely. So how do you go? Does the concept of truth give you any way to be able to say what is good and what is bad philosophy? And from what I can tell, the answer seems to be no.
Yeah, is it a categorical no? And let's talk about why it's no. Why, I mean, what are the definitions and what are the examples that we use? I mean, Plato's, I'll be straight up. Plato is a dogma. It's a dogmatic. This requires somebody to live within the heuristics of being a consciously virtuous person and saying to yourself, almost in a ritualistic behavior, that I'm going to be wise. I'm going to think this through. I'm going to think before I speak. I'm going to be temperate. I'm not going to be wild with my money. Okay, right? I'm going to participate in a just society where law and justice is really important to to what makes us a community, right? Okay. Now, have I fallen down? Have you disagreed with anything in that statement? No, you haven't. And humanity can be something other than that. And that's what I think the idea of the West is trying. That is the essence of the idea on the ideals of the West, which is something that there's an academic consensus that started at that period with Socrates. This is all I'm like banging the drum about to say, remember this, you guys. This is what we came to consensus on. And so if we live in a postmodern world where someone says, but I like Nietzsche better. Well, hey, look, in relation to Plato, it's worth knowing what Plato represents. It's worth knowing that ancient history is all I'm saying, right? And then Nietzsche, what he tries to do is he said, there's something underneath all of that. Well, Plato wouldn't disagree with that. He's saying, what makes us better than everybody else? Because we use our rational minds. We're not barbarians, right? He uses this term barbarians. So how do we cultivate the best human being that we can? And I don't see it at odds with the way economic systems work, right? I'm going to go back to one of the fathers of the liberal tradition, which is John Stuart Mill. And I'm listening to his stuff again, and he's like, we don't want unnecessary government. We want the right balance of government, the right balance of institutions. Welcome to the conversation, Professor Steve Keen. What are those? What are those, and how do we make those decisions? But you're the one, right? So you got to think about that. You have to participate in that.
Ty, can I
don't leave it to the politicians?
We haven't heard from you at all on this, but just the idea of your perceptions of truth when it relates to this, Ty, because I think you would have something to say about that in terms of empirical truth versus what else you might see from what Daniel's talking about.
Yeah, quite a few things. I listened to the whole show. First and foremost, congratulations, Dan, on finally getting a book out. That's a big accomplishment. So kudos to you. I'm remembering a story. Well, basically how my interest in economics started was around 2007 as things were leading up to the great financial crisis. And the first book I read was The General Theory. I didn't understand it, and I've read it probably 5 times since, and I still don't understand a lot of it, or I've learned to disagree with a lot of it, or I found new insights in it that I'm taking to heart. The second step in that process, after reading a book I did not understand and did not give me the answers in that moment in time, was to get a typical mainstream economic textbook, and it happened to be a macroeconomic textbook. Okay. And at the time, I didn't really understand the division of micro and macro, right? I didn't understand economics at all. Its structure, how it's taught. And I opened the book, and the interesting, supply and demand graphs were there. And I was like, whoa, that tickled the intellectual part of my brain. One of the first things I vividly saw in that book, and I remember it to this day, was the difference between normative and positive economics. And it triggered something in my head of, okay, what is economics to me? What matters to me, right? Is it the positive version, which is the data. You could maybe that's inductive, data, bringing in data, building models. Or is it the normative part where, there is a normative view on the way things are supposed to occur, right? And I quickly, in that moment, maybe over a few month period, I realized I did not care about the normative part because it wasn't providing the answers that I needed. Right. So I quickly developed a viewpoint that economists probably should stay out of philosophical what ought to be and what ought not to be, because generally the opinions vary so much that at the end of the day, if there's all those differing opinions, it's probably going to be wrong at the end of the day, whatever conclusion comes out of it. And of course, there's going to be multiple conclusions at the end of the day. So that's the one thing that struck me during your conversation is this is dives right into the question of what economics is. Is it, an ideology, what ought to be, or is it presenting what is, right? And I quickly went to the area of what is the economy and what happens when things, one variable is adjusted. How does that adjust another variable? So that's kind of where I sit. So I'm in a lot of ways, I'm outside of this conversation because I don't believe economists should be doing that. So I'm very strongly opposed to the libertarian Austrian branch of economics. And in fact, I'll go back even further to the marginalists and how they split neoclassicals and the Austrians split off. That there's a lot of ought to be this way in order for things to work properly, according to the person that is just making that statement. I know I was never really on board with that. And another thing that you guys were talking about was inductive or deductive ways to do research. And so here's a real practical. About a few weeks ago, there's a group of us that work at Modern Macro Technologies, and we are often, have this discussion about, how are we going to approach solving this problem? And it was interesting. You guys were talking about, I think it was Mike that actually kind of pointed it out. Generally, if you are, into positive economics, so it's showing the way things are, you will look at surface level data first, right? Looking for patterns. Who was it? Hume? Mike? Was it Hume you were mentioning?
Hume,
Yeah. So you will look at the general pattern, right? So that's your inductive, you're bringing in inductive data to your theory. Then you'll postulate some sort of theory of why you're seeing that. And then you'll test it on a model. Now, obviously, the model can be completely wrong, and we've got a century of economic models that have been completely wrong. But that's really struck me because I often, we've had these conversations because we're really not with the Austrians, and they're very, deductive logic and all that. And that circular argument that never ends, which comes first, the data or the logic, right? But you have to observe something first. You have to observe it. And that is an inductive part of the situation. If there's nothing to observe, then there is no theory, right? So that kind of struck me. That was interesting. And as for Plato and economics, like Steve, my strong suit is not philosophy. I've never been interested in the, who am I and the simulation theory, like Mike was saying, you drift off into all those different philosophies of being. I've never been interested in it because, like Steve says, I am really grounded in reality, like fundamental constants of the universe. If you start talking about the speed of light, or the velocity of gravity with the resistance of air, I'm going to be tickled pink, and I'll talk about that all day. But when it comes to that inner thinking, and although as I get older, I realize I need to do more of that, and as my wife would say, it's never been that interesting to me. So it's very hard for me to approach individual economics, as I like to call it, or human action or praxeology, and take it seriously. However, I do admit, because of the way I think, I might discount it too much. So those are my thoughts on what I've listened to over the last hour. And it's been a very interesting conversation. And boy, do I like seeing the Steve versus Dan thing. I think that's very entertaining. We need to do more of it.
Yeah. But I really feel like right beside Steve on so many things, right? And he's taught me a lot with his books, and I refer back to your books when I'm doing my research. In fact, one of the things I was hoping to talk about was I think I put Wilson on your radar at one particular point. He had one of his books he called Consilience, and this is a term from William Whewell, who invented the word science, right? But talk about path dependencies, Mike? Right, like how path dependent are we on this language vocabulary that the hegemony of Western culture is pretty much locked into? It's fascinating with those types of things. But this idea of consilience was really to bring together the arts and the sciences together, right? And so I know how it is. We kind of juxtapose and kind of battle each other a little back and forth, and I've always kind of been that with you. But I kind of inhabit that position. This is more of a something you're going to need to kind of explore in an abstract way and think, how do you think we could make these two things come together? Okay, and I want to propose the same as what E.O. Wilson proposed is that we use economics as that bridging gap. It's the hardest of the soft sciences, right? Is basically what he said. So what does that do to be able to bridge the arts? How does it bridge the arts into the sciences, right? And it's just leave the question at that. Like, start freeform associating what and how that would come to being. And you say, well, is that deductive? Yeah, but what's the definition? We're trying to even form that. Now, this ability for us to conjure concepts and try and form distinctions are part of a mental version of a phylogenetic chain, right? I mean, you say, well, that's it doesn't make sense. That's not biology. But our ability to think is something that goes back a long, long lineage. So let's practice that. What do you guys think?
Steve?
Well, I've been trying to find a foundation for economics which is free of ideology. That's a major driving force. And in fact, when you look at, if you talk about whether neoclassicals are Platonist or not, that's been a similar thing for them as well. They've been trying to find a foundation which is right for economics. And what they instantly went to is right to say we talk about individuals maximizing utility and firms maximizing profits and society reconciling the two through the market, et cetera, et cetera. And what you take a look at the concepts behind it, the ground concepts themselves are false. They haven't been able to show that marginal cost rises. In fact, it doesn't, it falls. One of their core concepts is false. There's so many false core concepts for them that it becomes a series of myths. But they never get outside Plato's cave to take a look at the real world and see, well, hang on a sec, we're wrong about that particular feature. Maybe we've got to change our underlying philosophy. They can't do it. Now, what and this has just been an accidental discovery in the last 5 or 6 years, the things which I chose as my foundation for doing economics, and that's largely Goodwin's growth cycle model, Minsky's inspiration about the financial instability hypothesis, and then ultimately, though I got there earlier, but also later, MMT. I first built a model of what you might call a model of MMT in 1992. So, but it's a complex systems model of MMT. But what I find, I realize I can derive all of that from strictly true macroeconomic definitions. Okay, you give me the definition of the employment rate, which is, if you can't work it out, go watch another show. The wages share of GDP, the private debt ratio, and government spending to GDP, and put those together with extremely simple simplifying assumptions, and I generate a fairly realistic model of capitalism, which gives you completely opposite conclusions about what is the role of government, what is the role of workers, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a situation which it's bad to have workers not being able to organize. They should be able to bargain for the wage. You get one where it's bad to let private debt get too high, whereas the neoclassical completely ignore it. And you get one where government spending is required to stop the system falling into a debt deflation. Now, I got all of that with absolutely zero ideology. And that's so in that sense, I've got the same objectives the neoclassicals have. They're just doing what Keynes said so well about, I think it was about Hayek. He said that Hayek's work was a demonstration of what can happen when a fearsome logician starts working from the wrong principles. You end up in bedlam. And that's what I think the neoclassicals are, but they think they're in truth.
Yeah. No, well said. I mean, I think, if the conversation is just to draw the distinctions and say that the feeling of the individual is not relevant to the art of this soon to become science, then that's a fine position to take, right? And might be the most practical, and I would say then the most ideal, because we can't, in your view of discernment, say that I think there's a better approach to do here, right? And you might say, well, I'm intensely biased because of my years of study, but you're not biased to the point where you've been misdirected. You're saying this is a real value to society and a contribution to society as a whole. And here's what I think, and here's the reasons why, right? And I like to believe that eventually will get looked at, that eventually will move in that particular direction. Now, are there perturbations that go kind of the other way? And there are lots of things that are not realized and integrated into the societies, right? I mean, there's a long trajectory of tragic endings for societies, right? And
I expect we're going to be another one.
That's the point, right? Thinking about these questions, I think, is and Ty, like, he always underestimate himself. He always gets into it with me when I talk philosophy with him. He gets in, he does that, and blah, blah, blah. His most recent one was, he was kind of locked into the deterministic. He's like, no, I'm that's it. I can't do anything. I loved it. It was great.
Daniel, is this a good place for you to plug your own business since you're here rather than me do it for you? What do you think?
Yes.
See, the deterministic voice of God just spoke there. Look, I for the longest time I've had Planksip. It's a media outlet, and up until this summer, it was a philosophy and culture media outlet trying to change what it means to consume. So, right at its central message, we're trying to help the consumption fixation on things that are destroying our planet. We donate 1% of all our revenues to carbon capture technology. And we've got as a media outlet, we're looking for contributors. We're looking for people that want to put their ideas on our platform. And, that's effectively what we do. I mentioned that up until recently, we've done a big change, focusing more on Plato, and want to be more specialized. There's a lot of people and a big community of philosophers and thinkers that want to reimagine Plato, and that's why the book is called what it is, and that's why I've got a community that I'm looking to build, and hopefully as many people as possible want to participate in that kind of thinking, and that's about it.
Can you do Dave's now, like business film booth, and just off the top of your head, you may not know what it's about, but just make stuff up, and the domain name's right there on the side. So go.
Okay, so film booth with Dave. This is I'm coming across as somebody that's been a client or a customer, and I haven't really, but basically, what defines Dave and his ability to communicate with an audience? Well, first of all, you're seeing is believing. And if you've seen this show, and if you've seen Dave at any point in the past, you'll see that he looks directly in the camera, and he's very well spoken. It means that he's articulating things in real time, right? There's no lag time. He's a pretty good thinker, and he engages with people on this show and with his clients. Hint, hint, he wants you to sign up. So go to his website and sign up, because he'll do video work for you, because he's a communicator on the internet in this kind of environment and in ads and all sorts of stuff. So go check him out. and you won't
Thank
be
you. That's
disappointed.
almost something like
Almost.
what I do as well. So that's
Kinda.
pretty good. Well done. Well done, good sir.
See, there's Ty. Like, he's the perturbation. So he's like, if it's all deterministic, fuck it. I'm just going to be the perturbator, right? I'm going to, I don't know. I'm not saying that word right, but like the shock to the system Mike talked about in the system thing. He's like, I will be the shock.
And I'll plug let's plug Steve's Substack too, because if you didn't know, if you haven't listened to us before, Steve has Substack and Patreon, so you can get a critical look at economics from Professor of Economics. And for more, check out his page, patreon.com, Prof Steve Keen, or just Google Prof Steve Keen. You're going to find him pretty quick. Most of the posts are free and access. There's no paywall to start. So maybe that's the place to go. And there's somewhere else now, Steve, too, because of Ravel. Do you want to just give us a lowdown on that?
Yeah, well, actually, Ravel is something I'm going to be spending a lot of time working on in the next couple of weeks, because the commercial side of Ravel it's a data analysis system built on top of what used to be Minsky, and it uses a graphical means to handle multidimensional data. And Mike was talking about our difficulty of being able to run mental models. We equally have difficulty handling data which has got more than 2 dimensions to it. So this is a visual tool that lets you easily handle multidimensional data and analyze it rapidly, and a way of replacing spreadsheets as well. However, what I've now realized is the most important part of Ravel right now is the old Minsky, because we are seeing so many catastrophes around the world, the global governments deciding they've got to stop borrowing from the public. Okay? Terrible how much they're borrowing to the public. They're crowding out what the private sector can do, and we've got to cut government spending and leave more space for the private sector. Okay, there's only one problem. When you do the accounting, they're not borrowing from the public. They're creating money for the public. It's the exact opposite of what they think they're trying to achieve. And we're now about to get a budget imposed in the UK. I'm currently in Amsterdam, but I can wave hello at London from here. I think October 30. Where, from what I understand, the Chancellor has told her department's heads to find 10% savings, cutting capital expenditure. And she believes that's going to make the economy grow. So what Ravel lets you do with the godly tables, the tables that do double entry bookkeeping and show the structure of the economy, is you can actually lay out the accounting structure of financial transactions. And when you do it, you try to fit the way they think into the double accounting system. If the world was like they think it is, in other words, if households were lending to firms and lending to governments, and it was taxpayers' money, then they'd be right. Okay, there's a catastrophe coming up. But it takes me about 2 minutes to build a model where the catastrophe occurs because we're borrowing from households, and then say, well, actually, the debt's owned by the banks, not by the households. Okay? And that one simple change means that the exact opposite of what happens in their loanable funds model happens in the real world. So if they try to cut back on government spending to let the economy grow more rapidly, they make it grow more slowly. And so I'm going to be doing a live demo of that. I hope to record it tomorrow. So in some ways, and this sounds egotistical, but I'll use it anyway, I think Ravel's about the most important software package on the planet right now, because the incredible mistakes that are being made, which fundamentally come from not understanding the structure of the financial system. And Ravel is the first program with this, what we used to call Minsky, and the component that most matters is the godly tables. With that component, you can understand the structure of the financial system. And once you do that, you can see that every government on the planet, most financial institutions, and certainly most journalists talking about economics are completely wrong about what to do. And by having a full structural model of the economy, they are destroying the real economy.
Very good.
It's amazing. It's amazing after all these years with the advent and popularity of MMT that people haven't figured out what Steve just described. I put out a tweet a couple days ago that described in 240 characters what Steve just said. And of course, the argument then turns to, well, the central banks are independent of the government, blah, blah, blah. But we all know, central banks are formed from government decree, and they just support economic growth. It's quite amazing, though, that it goes back to the what ought to be and what ought not to be, instead of just looking at just look at the institutional arrangements to understand what is actually happening. And then you can make your own individual opinions and how you're going to function in this world. But it's amazing how the gray area forms when somebody doesn't agree with the institutional arrangements. Ideology comes into play in a debate, and the argument kind of loses all structure of actually learning something. So it's quite amazing. I'm just always shocked that we're still trying to tell people that the government has to create these funds for primary dealers to buy the treasuries, right? This is all functioning on the central bank's ledger, not in the secondary market where treasuries are traded in the private sector. That's an after effect. That does not matter to the initial primary auction. And those funds are created by the central bank first to buy those bonds. It's amazing people can't figure that out.
I wonder if culturally it's so terrifying to people to question. Like, don't think of just the economists and people who are defending those positions. I mean, you put it to your circle of mates, and it completely bends people's heads, and they're invested in the system as it operates to them anyway, so they support it. I think it's really hard for people to switch.
This is where it comes back to models versus the real world. They're invested in their model, and the model they've learned is it's fundamental. It's the model you can come up with when you don't think deeply enough, or where you praxeology, where you think you can, inquire into your own mind and work out what the structure of the financial system is. No praxeologist that I've ever observed has started saying, well, we've got to use double entry bookkeeping for the financial system, of course. No, they think money is a fucking commodity, and off they go on that stupid line. So with the people believing introspection as opposed to induction can lead you to reality, they're off with the fairies, and that they think they're logically and they're deducing the real world. Mike, I haven't heard you attack Austrians yet. We need you to throw your shovel against the Austrians.
I thought you were talking about proctologists there for a minute, so I was
pretty close.
I
think praxeology and proctology are intrinsically related.
Where's this going? I don't want to be here if it's going there.
Neither do I.
Thankfully, that's not what you were saying. But I thought, at first I was like, what? Let me take this in a little bit of an offshoot thing, because I think this is relevant to why a lot of us are here. So this week at WPI, we got 2 different phone calls from corporations, very large corporations, that have suddenly discovered that they're very interested in dynamic systems modeling.
All right.
And they have projects that they would like done. They're kind of taking how will our products impact short and long run, holistically, climate change, farmers, the environment, whatever. And do we do that kind of thing? And I said, well, why, yes, that's exactly what we do. But I started to get a little nervous because they were talking about some goodly amounts of money. Of course, it doesn't go to me, it goes to the school and trickles down after all the mafioso take their cuts from the top of the university on down. So when it gets to us, there's very little left. But nevertheless, and we have a capacity problem. We have lots of students who have been introduced to dynamic systems modeling. And so they're aware of what it is. They can boot up Stella or Minsky or what have you. They can open up somebody else's model and run it. But that's about as far as we've taken them. They're busy doing other things, and what have you. And if these chunks of money come in, these companies are going to want high-level modeling done, but we don't have enough people who know how to do it at a high level. And that is going to be becoming a problem. The more we are heard from venues like this, and the more people say, I'd like that done. I understand what you're saying, and this is great. The more I'm going to have to say no, or start calling colleagues at other universities or whatever, because we just don't have we don't have a very deep bench of good modelers. So if we're at all being listened to, we got to think about training some people to do this stuff at a very high level. And otherwise we got to shut up because we're starting. I think, to become a little effective in convincing people that the grand challenges of the day, wicked problems, these sorts of matters require the sorts of tools like we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a challenge. Yeah.
Can I either Steve or Mike? When do in economics? When does the student start learning, equilibrium modeling? Like, is that Econ 101? Is that the second year of a degree?
2 lines right out of the box. 2 lines crossing at a point.
But actually, building a mathematical model is a different story. So when do you start building mathematical models?
Yeah.
Of those concepts, that's more like it.
Yeah.
That's a weird one to answer, because when I went through, you might start building mathematical models in the 3rd or 4th year. You're doing it on honors degree, whereas most of them just got the out of the box supply and demand stuff, and that was about it. But now it seems that because the neoclassicals are trying to pretend they're a science, they hit students with having to work out models in first year in some universities, like at Cambridge, they're getting straight away into what they call the Euler equation, and you're getting to explain and try to build DSGE models as if it's scientific, which is the same as if you went to astronomy class and you got asked, please make up a set of epicycles and equants to explain the Earth as the center of the universe. That'd be what they're doing. But strictly speaking, I think only a tiny fraction of people actually get trained in building mathematical models and get assessed on it. So I would say normally it's going to come at the sort of the 3rd year level for an undergrad degree. And then when you do a PhD, almost always when you're doing a PhD, it's used to be building a computable general equilibrium model of your national economy. Now they're building DSGE models of their national economy.
Daniel, you had something to add in there?
Sorry?
Okay, so I'm gonna bring the dose of practicality into this, right? So Mike, you're talking way in the abstract. You got the Platonist going to kind of focus you on this. So let's get logistical on this. How many new highly trained economists do you need in the next 6 to 12 months, 12 months to a year to 2, 2 to 5? And let me keep asking, but please.
Yeah, no, I would if I had a dozen modelers at my disposal, that would get us going well.
Great.
And when I say modelers, they have to know what they're doing. They can't be, they had a 7-week class, they got a hold of the software, and now they're building lots of terrible models. They have to be,
Exactly. So let me say, then you go to somebody, and like you guys started to kind of like fall into this kind of blasé place and say, well, it's at the undergrad level and we got to get them when they're young and all this kind of BS. And I'm thinking, well, you know what? Go to the engineering firms.
What we need is engineering style training. That's definitely true.
But I'm saying if you want a fast mercenary-like workforce, engineers are a great option, because if you can incent them to come over and invest so that they have that applied existing knowledge and apply it to your discipline, that's available at scale and very quickly. Okay, so there's a practical thing to say that engineers can actually do that, and they've got that proven mental consistency to do things like look at data and understand things in complexity, right?
Yeah, historically in the field of system dynamics, most PhDs in system dynamics, although their degrees don't literally say system dynamics, but that's their thing. Their undergraduate degrees were in engineering, and they were naturally attracted to system dynamics. Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, formulate the plan. Go and convince the conservatives that every dollar spent doesn't mean money out of the pocket of the government or the people.
Really, my ultimate question is, when was this sort of difference equation math introduced to econ students? And in that process, are you able to insert a broader definition of what mathematics in that process, i.e. exploring ODEs, some engineering concepts, to start giving a base? And obviously this would take a decade or two, but it would start providing the actual knowledge to an econ student on how to develop a system dynamic model. Is that possible? Or is the training of an econ student so bloated with bullshit that you can't fit that in at this point?
I'm going to go for the latter.
Not
Guys,
not a loaded question.
I just do the traditional stuff with system dynamics and make it dynamic. So you say comparative statics, here's an equilibrium, here's an equilibrium. You don't know what happens in between the two. We do the exact same thing, but now we can see the time path in between the two. And then we say, what if we clean up some of the concepts here? Because when you look at it from a dynamic point of view, a stock flow point of view, you say, this doesn't look right. And then you say, what's wrong?
Yeah.
Fix the stock flow structure. And now, instead of just a smooth transition from one equilibrium point to the next, you get oscillations and all sorts of interesting, realistic behavior. To do that requires a knowledge of arithmetic. So if you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide in your intro econ class, you can do what I just said. Now that's against what the profession teaches, but yeah, we can do it right now. I do it.
Okay, so
every
we need to actually start a cloning program. So we need to clone Mike Radzicki and get him into every academic institution on the planet, so we can start moving this along. That is my solution to the problem.
Well, that's
so
in fact
going back
what's
to
necessary.
path to path pedancy. Now, not so much, but back in the day, it was very common for professors to have book representatives visit them. And it was usually a kid right out of college, young kid, and is working for Macmillan or Prentice Hall or one of these big textbook publishing companies. And they want to give you an examination copy of the latest, greatest intro econ book or intermediate. And they want you to, of course, adopt it. Constantly, they're beating on the door with the latest, greatest, and what have you. And then a lot of the reps, too, were told, hey, if a professor is doing something innovative, get their information, because we might want them to write the next textbook. Right. And so one day I had a kid from Prentice Hall. He's banging on the door. And I said, no, I'm good. I do my own thing. Oh, really? My editor said I should find, if somebody's doing something interesting. And I said, wow, system dynamics. And he said, do you have anything to print out that I can take along? And I said, yeah, I got some stuff here. So the kid took it along. A month unfolds, and I get a phone call from the econ editor. And he said, Professor Radzicki, this is the most innovative stuff I've ever seen in economics. And he said, there is no way on the planet we would ever publish this in a book.
That's the trouble.
He said, because my sales reps would go out across the country and put this book on a professor's desk in, California or something, and they wouldn't know what the hell it is. We'd sell 0 books.
And that's the trouble.
I told that to Dave Polander once, the famous textbook author. And he said, Mike, there's a 15% rule. You can be 15% innovative, and you better be 85% the same as the standard textbooks, or nobody's going to publish your book.
Yeah. So there's no chance. There's no chance, in other words. Yeah. That's why I'm teaching outside the university sector these days. I'll be starting teaching at the University of Amsterdam next year, by the way. So I'm into a compatible course there, which should be quite enjoyable. So there's some tiny pockets around the world, but generally speaking, the problem is they go toward equilibrium. And if you stand next to a neoclassical economist on a podium, one way to get past the time is to count how many times they use the word equilibrium. And once you've got equilibrium, that's the end of your dynamics. Okay, the system is not changing. They don't realize that's the case, but it locks out evolutionary thought, it locks out dynamic analysis. So the further they go down the whole of doing an economics degree, the less capable they are of thinking in a dynamic, non-equilibrium evolutionary way. So it's a really, really dangerous system in that sense, and that's why I want to get engineers to take over economics.
The solution, I think, is to do like somebody mentioned. Jordan Peterson started his own university. You start your own online, if you will, university, whatever you want to call it, and you make it modestly priced. And then when people learn how to do it our way, that's the way to put it, they go to the business community, to the government, to the media, to the educated citizen, and you bypass the profession. And I think there's an appetite for economics that actually explains what's going on and so forth. But trying to get the profession to
not
change.
Not going to happen. Yeah. I've got to do it outside, which is why this group is such a lot of fun and so important. So And I'm doing my own little university courses developing through that. If you get some crazy marketing from me, if it involves a woman called Nicole, it's genuine. It might not feel that way, but it's genuine, okay?
I thought it was a
Good to
future
know.
wife that was contacting me. I
Oh,
got that
please.
wrong.
Oh, lucky you. Don't tell your own wife, okay?
Daniel, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Do you want to do top chatters for us? Tradition you're very familiar with, but you probably haven't done in a while. So
Yeah, let's do it.
a stab at it. If we can get top chatters up, that'd be great. And then after that, Daniel, we'll cover anything that you think maybe you've thought of that we haven't chatted about just yet. But let's try and cover that too.
Julia, are you going to put the top chatters up? Okay.
Okay,
there we go.
Web freaks. We got Ghost on a Half Shell. I was going to say her real name, but maybe she'd be mad at me. So Scott the News, Economics in One Lesson, Tony Waka Udezi, Danger Zone Dragai, Geraldine S., Reagan Boychuk, Rob Pierce, Michael D'Souza, Jen Zidek, White and Sunny Out, TR, Jen Zidek, twice. Wow, okay. Thomas Darlington, Algo Rhythm, Sherry Wise, Amelia Sempri, Bob Lior, The Herald of Change, Nicole Wolfeck, Kiao, Matt T34314333, Gavin Van, Alpha, Nomad Livecast.
That one's mean.
Which one?
The one with the numbers is like just to
the
get
one
more
with the
airtime.
numbers, yeah.
Yeah. The Nomad Livecast, William Turner, William Branch, David K, Ken Crawford, The Nasty Ant, Sam Silver, Wayne P, Shot, David Collins, Dan Gibbo 675, Rusty, Lida Raza, Toasty Death, Rob Pierce, Garen Osborne, G's, Jose, John Carter, Nilavakar. Okay.
Well done, good sir. Thank you very much.
It's much. It's just like really big list now.
It's a big list.
Yeah.
Well, mate, look,
We've grown. We've grown, Dan.
Yeah.
Should we? Do you think it's just been a couple of minutes, just having another look at your book, and maybe just if you want to plug it, where to buy it? What are your thoughts on that? Should we just cover that again for us for those that missed it at the beginning?
Yep.
Oh, sure. I guess
It's a big achievement
okay.
writing a book, obviously.
Yeah, so it's available on all the platforms like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and this kind of thing. It's for anybody who's a librarian out there. It actually functions more like a reference book, and there's going to be an active course that's available right on planksip.org. Just go there. It's going to be pretty obvious. Just follow the breadcrumbs to Plato, and the book is there. If you are considering it, if you do it and you use the code Steve, the course will be reduced to a mere $99 from $199. So go sign up, and those proceeds go to the man in the corner with the headset on.
Very good. Well, Daniel, what is in all of this chat? There must be things that we have missed that we should still talk about. We've got a little bit of time. What's one thing that's come up that you've been clanking around your head that you thought, I didn't get to say this, or perhaps we didn't get to explore this?
No, I think the idea of the show and Friends was really, captures the spirit of it. I think that Mike and, now you, Dave, but also Ty and Steve, me from interacting with me for hours and hours and hours, right? And so I think the nice bow that I could put on this for somebody who wants to spend time with Plato is because you actually want to, spend time with Plato. You want to experience Plato, and if you're not in that bent, then it's probably not going to make sense for you, right? It's really valuable, but you got to be in the right mindset. Right, you got to have the bandwidth for it, and you know what? I think today's commodities of whatever we measure human activity in, but attention span, we only have so much. We only have so many waking hours, and I'd love to see some fellow Platonists join. Like I said, the proceeds go to Steve, but that's it. And I really enjoyed.
Is there going to be an audio version so people can listen in their car?
Yeah, so there's 32 lectures. They're on YouTube right now, but they're like pre-recorded and they use AI. So the real dialogue has to happen when we're in a community. So I think there's a few different ways to try it out. If there's people that are really against AI generation and stuff, then if that bugs you, then you probably won't want to watch the YouTube videos. But the book itself is 600 pages of like direct references and very, very heavily footnoted. Like it's a really, it's a reference book. It could be considered a scholarly book, I suppose, in a way. But it's something to keep on the shelf and look up when you're, reading the dialogues, right? And
is the actual book? Is the actual book? Is there an audio version of the book?
No, not yet, but maybe I would do that. Yeah.
Well, huge thank you to our guest, Daniel Sanderson. Thanks for being back, mate. Good to see you back on the show. Till next time, everybody else, take care, be nice, look after yourself. Remember to brush your teeth, visit your mum, hit subscribe and that bell so you know we're on next time. For now, it's goodbye from Steve Keen and friends, and we'll see you next week. Cheers, Daniel. Take care, mate.